Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn uh, here with Christine Seely. Currently, Christine Seely is included in our group show Dissonance and Resonance, which was guest curated by Terry Evans with 4 photographers. So the full title of the show is Dissonance and Resonance, 4 photographers. We're thrilled to have Christina here talking to us via Zoom. And Christina is a visual artist originally from Berkeley, California, whose multidisciplinary photographic practice stretches into the fields of science, design, sound, and architecture, culminating in a range of visual and collaborative translations. She has she has a broad national and international exhibition record, including the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, the West Collection, and the Walker Art Center. She currently is a professor at Dartmouth and has had completed residencies at such wonderful places as the Headland Center and with us as well, and the McDowell Colony. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Christina Seely. Please, by the way, put your questions up. We are recording this Zoom, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them on Facebook Live, or you can put them in the chat window here. Without much further ado, here's Christina Seely.
Hello, everybody. So thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you everyone there at the Salina Art Center who's just helped make this happen, this show happen. It's been a great experience working with you guys. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity to work, especially with Terry Evans, who's here, whose work and understanding of the power of artistic dialogues has long inspired me. And then also just have work included in this exhibition with such powerful work by my fellow participating artists. So it's interesting. This is the first time I've done kind of live stream, but I always start my talks by bringing up kind of that we're all gathering in this sort of like disconnected and fragmented virtual space. And we can sometimes forget that there's a way to be sort of intentional in that. And I think some people are actually physically there in Kansas. So I just invite everyone to kind of take a minute to get present in whatever way that means, in whatever form you're listening, in just turning off devices and sort of, you know, feeling like or preparing like you're in an auditorium listening to me give you a talk. So and I think this it's actually an important conversation. Like or it's so easy to get distracted. So to just sort of like have a minute to bring ourselves to the present and in full attention. And I'll note, I also at the end of this will give a kind of performative reading, and it will just resonate more deeply if you're really present with me. So that's part of it too. But I also understand it's a complex time, so if that's challenging, I also completely understand. So I'd like to start with these thoughts within a life deeply dedicated to the complexity of our fraught relationship to the natural world. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded land of the Ohlone, Chocheyeno, and Karkin peoples on which I'm speaking from today. My work increasingly sits in relationship to indigenous ways of knowing. In this, I want to acknowledge these ancient philosophies as powerful and important guides with deepest gratitude and humility. And I'd also like to acknowledge the land as a living entity in its own right. And lastly, would like to acknowledge that we are all interconnected and entangled family as both humans and non-human life on this planet. So I'm a research-based artist, and I've spent the past decade working infield in the Arctic and the tropics alongside scientists. This unique research path, augmented by research in natural history museums and collections, forms an interchange between art and science, and is focused on eliciting lasting and potent emotional understandings of anthropocentric climate change. I create projects that investigate and translate interrelating global systems in order to help a public register and face our realities to our tenuous relationship to the planet. Each of my projects builds on the previous, and the arc of my practice reflects our ever-evolving and complicated position within a set of natural and man-made systems. Beyond my love affair with both the edge and center of things, throughout my life as an artist, I've been in a deep, wild affair with the mediating powers of the photographic and the way the modern world depicts, views, and interrelates with the natural world. While it was more subtle at first, the human hand has always been present in my work, pointing to the human as a perceiver, as an impactor, and as entangled in, but also disconnected from the systems I'm usually exploring. While I increasingly work in a range of media, I am most often trying to tell you that there's more than what you see through through mediation, as it's always I've always felt a vital pull towards drawing attention to what is just beyond the visible. Even in my earliest work, I drew on the dissonance between what is and what is recorded. So I deal with two main monsters in my work: the current climate crisis and photography in its broadest terms. The world I was working in when I started out as an image-based artist 15 years ago, dealing with our relationship to the environment, was a very different world and culture than it is now. In that short time, the idea of global culture has been established, and an understanding of ourselves as planetary community has settled out. Interconnections made possible and created by the internet and new technologies has reinforced this and introduced many new ways of interacting with images and each other. And both the widespread introduction of the concept of climate change that has quickly evolved into the climate crisis in its realities in the form of strengthening storms and fires and melting ice caps, and not to mention the COVID pandemic, et cetera, have all evolved dramatically. And I'm right now, I live on the East Coast normally, but I am now in Northern California where I grew up, and it feels very present here. The fire threat, I got an alert yesterday that there might be a lightning storm and we should have a bag packed, possibly to leave in the middle of the night if fires started. So it feels very, very tangible and present here. And we're in a huge drought in California here. So just worth noting, I'm inside of it, talking to you from inside of it. And we now live in a moment when the climate crisis is present in our daily lives. And we're also inundated with photographic images on a daily basis, images that are used in a range of ways and contexts as cultural communication. In many ways, in an age when we can supplant or shift or replace direct experience of reality with lives lived continuously through the use of technology, the contemporary unknown we can actually define as what we actively decide not to experience in a way. So essentially by our newly formed indirect relationship to reality. One could ironically argue we now know much more, but also much less. In an age of indirect leaning, when viewers are constantly exposed to an ever-evolving sea of images, even more so within COVID, when we're sort of like stuck in our screen worlds, the photographic has become increasingly complex. It has also become the expected conduit for reality, as well as synonymous with reality, especially for a younger generation. And I really see this as a professor and a teacher, educator. One could argue that the photographic is a stand-in that is starving our other senses. In this, I'm interested in how to elicit through a photograph a registration that goes beyond sight to draw up the full embodied system of self. And this fails sometimes, but it's a big sort of problem I'm circling around in my work. Oh, sorry, quickly, I'm going to skip those guys. So the two key interconnected elements that underlie my practice are research and experimentation. And I'll sort of explain in a second why I want to make sure to bring this dialogue in. And you'll see I often push or point back to the traditional boundaries of photographic media. And I'm thinking a lot recently about the value and relevance of this approach to making, just as an artist, creative thinker. I don't think artists are thought of or valued as scholars or researchers enough, especially in the United States. And I'm speaking from within an prestigious academic institution, even, right? That we have this unusual agency to bridge disciplines and create new thinking and knowledge and exceptional critical thinking skills that are inherent to translating complex ideas. And the experience of art has untapped power to help the public address and face into what's unfolding. So while I quickly talk through my practice today, I'm just keep in mind this research lens and the unique ability art has to help kind of change, unfold, or bring up big questions, which is we're all inside of right now. And almost all of my work really deconstructs the photographic. So in whatever way I'm using photography or the photographic, because it's sometimes sort of the edge of, I don't know, it's not always a photograph, but it's sometimes subtle and sometimes it's really obvious. In order to point back to how we look at the environment and our place within its system. So I'm really trying to use sort of that, like pointing back to mediation, or the way I'm using a language that we realize we've learned through photographs and on purpose to really get you to think about our place within these systems. And it's increasingly designed as a kind of set of portals to draw up vulnerability and a kind of softening that it can allow meaning making to happen and to surface. So we're often so inundated with images that we get conditioned, right? We can't even kind of feel what we're looking at anymore, which is it's a really kind of wild phenomenon we're really inside of. So in this, one major aspect of my approach over the last 15 years has been to find ways of positioning the viewer within systems, planet in global systems. So what you see on the screen is this diagram of an architectural project called Atlas of Guilty Territories by Elena Langen and Liam Moritz, that's describing the transportation of sands from a specific site in the Earth to different locations on the planet. And when I say that, you can actually really comprehend this idea with the visual you see on the screen. It's fairly simple, these lines drawn that are brown, relating this, this color to sand, and this distribution's obvious just through this simple diagram. And then now your brain may have already flipped this image over to something more recognizable, but most contemporary viewers have a more centered location in the idea of the world because this is such a familiar version of the world map. And even if you see a version with the continents shifted in one direction or the other, it may take your mind a minute to recognize what you're looking at. And you may try to reposition it. We have this very, very fixed kind of version of this map in our mind, with the north at the top, south at the bottom, west to left, east to right. And this is the most familiar to the Western world viewer. And as a side note, the poles were often, for a period of time, left out of this map, which I find really interesting and conceptually. And then I would argue they probably won't be anymore because they're incredibly important with what's unfolding. So in this case here, I have to, there we go. I think it'll start. Okay, so in this case, this is like a diagram, a sort of illustration of registering time passing in a fairly straightforward way, again, in relationship to planet and planetary systems. And this is a map of vegetation growing over the course of a year. And Kansas, there's so much agriculture, so this probably also really registers in a really deep way. The sense of time passing is just like what's happening, the green and growth. And then, as summer or fall harvest, winter comes, right? You have this shift into drier, that sort of arid looking color, right? So it's this very simple GIF, but you really can understand time passing, and even like on an annual basis by this simple thing. So now thinking about scale as well, this is a drawing of many routes of the Mississippi River over centuries. And we can understand the sense of time in a fairly straightforward drawing because this river is scalable to the body and the landscape we find familiar. And the language of mapping is also familiar. So it's kind of fascinating. It's just these sort of squiggles of lines, but we actually really can comprehend the water carving its way through this landscape in over millennia, or even hundreds of years. And then this is another version where it's looking at water like straight downstream and the way it's carved a path through. And this, again, is just a series of lines, but our brain can actually really understand the scale of this and the impact, like what these lines mean about time and place. And then this is a glacier that reads as an island, and we each are an island as a body, so we can comprehend the impacts of change to this scaled to us. And so I'm breaking this down because we have such a complicated relationship to scaling the planet to our body and vice versa to connect with large scale or layered impacts. In this, over the last few years, I've been working out tools to use in my work that kind of match our cognitive, our thinking capabilities to help us relate to often abstract and complex happenings on a global scale. So I'm going to introduce you, I'll just really quick, I'm going to sort of breeze through a bunch of projects that are in, and quite a few pieces, there are multiple pieces that are in the show there, so I'll highlight those, but this gives you sort of an arc of the way I think and how to position that work and that you're in physically in the space. So I'm going to introduce a series of projects quickly with this kind of research lens. So here's Lux. The goal is to successfully translate how man-made light signifies complexity of humans' collective relationship to the planet. So as impactors and innovators. So the first project I ever made was called Lux, and I started working on it in 2005 based on this NASA map of the world at night, which was composited actually in 2002. And so this is what the world looked like 18 years ago at night. And I was not interested in just the man-made light in general, but in the three brightest regions on the map, which are essentially the first world, and what they represent about human impact, as well as the complexity of what man-made light represents about us, which is inherently reflects a deep impact on the planet, but also includes ingenuity, growth, progress, romance, etc., which are fundamentally positive and hopeful things. So I found this a more true and complex recognition of our relationship to the planet, in that this light isn't just about light pollution, but also about all of these other kind of amazing elements of our human species. And then the other thing to note now is that China on this map has completely changed, and I had not have imagined that at that time. There's just no way, like the amount of change that's happened. It's like it's a really different map now. And I decided to photograph the cities in these three brightest regions, not just the largest cities in the world, but the US, really seeing the US, Western Europe, and Japan, and kind of understanding them as this like collective power, right, of that brightness as information. And so these were taken with an analog 4x5 camera, old school kind of field camera, and printed at 4x5 feet. And my exposures, I was only recording man-made light, so always after something called civil twilight. It's like the sort of nautical scientific moment when it's properly dark. And so my exposure times were between 1 and 4 hours. This is Tokyo from one of the furthest suburbs. And again, this is all man-made light, so I'm only showing you man-made light. And each piece is titled Metropolis, followed by the city's latitude and longitude. And I was really careful to exclude iconic buildings. This is New York City. It took a long time to figure out where to position myself to sort of not have it read as it's so famous for its skyline, right? And those are flights coming up from Newark Airport, and I'm looking down from Jersey City across to that's the lower Manhattan on the left and Jersey City on the right. And sorry, flights are coming up from Newark Airport. And then these are designed to hang in a group setting. This is at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. And they were always shown with the NASA map key, which I'll show you in a second. So they're meant to sort of interrelate too. So you're really thinking back to like the local and the global. And here's the key. This is a version of the key. There are many versions, but where then you have to sort of seek out where you are, what you're looking at. And some of them, if you're familiar with a city, you might know the city, but I really excluded sort of iconic viewpoints and made sure it was something unusual. So to help the viewer stay longer with the work too. And then this is just my camera. This is the camera that I use, and this is like my little box. I called it the box of potential. The first trip I took was in Europe, and they're negatives, so they're 4x5. They're large sheet negatives. I took 1 to 3 photographs a city, so it's very different than the way we think about using our phones now. And they were, I think I had 15. I was in maybe about 9 cities, and there are 19. You can see 19 shots, and I just had to carry it around and hope that I got what I needed. And mostly I did. I mean, it took me 5 years to do this project because it was a massive, epic kind of thing. This is Amsterdam. It's the only city I photographed from in a building because it's obviously at sea level. And it's very obvious when you're on top of a building. So I kept asking them for they kept wanting to give me a really high room. And I was in a hotel, and I was just like, I need like the 3rd floor. They did not understand. And so I could kind of feel like, help you feel, a viewer feel like you're sort of in it with the city. And then this is Boston, which I usually show actually because I'm usually closer to Boston. But and this, you see there's kind of scribbling in the water. And there's this line in the sky. That line are flights landing in Logan Airport. And then the tide's coming in, so there's this little gentle movement of the water over the exposure time. And it's this really beautiful relationship between tidal or natural time and scheduled time, flight time, which is always a good segue into my next project, which was Markers of Time. And there's a couple pieces in the show that Deflau Animalis, I'll show you in a second, from this project. So the research goal was in order to create a resonance about our problematic disconnection with our home planetary environment, which keeps us from understanding and effectively caring for it. The aim is to translate our perception of time, really, our sort of relationship to modes of time, that can reveal a distinction between man-made and natural time, which we really live in this very disconnected sort of relationship to natural cycles. So I moved up in 2009 to Alaska for 6 months. I quit my job. I was teaching out here in San Francisco at the California College of the Arts, and I had this profound experience the previous summer. I was really lucky and was able to go on this very small ship out the Aleutian chain during the height of summer migration. And I was set inside of this evolving set of natural systems. There's proliferation of animals, of whales and seabirds, and bear were coming out, and the light was long, so 22 hours of daylight, and it just changed my life. It was such a dramatic experience compared to 5 years now sitting in the dark, like sort of watching our disconnect from natural nighttime, photographing for Lux. And so I had this deep kind of really like soul-based, guide to go up and start making work up there. And so I moved there for 6 months from summer to winter solstice to experience the evolution of perpetual day to perpetual night, and started this project that was built up of small like component pieces as a way, just because I was kind of going crazy with making the same kind of image for 5 years with Lux. So it was a way to just sort of design into my practice of just exploration, experimentation, all kinds of stuff to keep it interesting. And I really just circled around 3 ideas of time. And here I'm just on the frozen Arctic Ocean on the left, as you see the moons rising, way north Alaska, near Barrow, Alaska, and then same place on the right, but in the middle. This is the midnight sun, so in the middle of the summer when it's perpetual day. So the 3 ideas I was circling around were UGIS, was just the constant, so geologic time, the sun, moon, and stars. Metra is like Latin for measure, so this idea of measured time, man-made time versus natural time, like the Boston image. And then muto means to change, so looking at how climate change is throwing off seemingly fixed cycles. And then I was starting to use the tropics too. I eventually, after this time up in Alaska, started to think about regions that were bookending wherever the first world is. Actually, is where Lux really was situated, where the most dramatic impacts of climate change at the time were very present. And so that the project evolved to include these 2 regions. It's now become a really normal sort of conversation in my work, actually. And it became increasingly difficult to describe, there's such abstract, something as abstract and enormous as climate change is like the ever challenging, kind of like a monster to manage. But I began to think about visual references that could play out this idea, and started thinking about animals that are coat-changing species. So this is an Arctic fox up in Svalbard. I went on a program which is way north of Norway, a group of islands way up there in the Arctic. And their coat change is based on length of day. So it has nothing to do with when the snow falls. It's just a certain time of year their coat changes. And so now the snow falls too late and melts too early, and they're bright white on the brown tundra, and then increasingly vulnerable. And there are quite a few different coat changing species with this issue. And this is just such a helpful visual. It's very clear. It's really helpful in describing that problematic time. What's the right word? Sort of just whatever that the cycle's thrown off. And you see here me trying the diptych is of me, and actually in Alaska, trying to replace where there are foxes to where it should belong in the snowy setting. And so then this is a diptych called Helios, which means the sun. It's the Greek god of sun, the sun. And you see the half-hour exposure of the midnight summer sun on the left of the Arctic Ocean, where you saw that my camera a couple slides ago. And on the right is in the Galapagos. I'm looking straight up through a palm tree at noon, where the length of day is constant all year round along the equator. So there's this pendulum of time changing in the Arctic and Antarctic, and then this consistent sort of cycle of time along the equator. And I'm just kind of breezing. I could tell you more, but I just want to get further along. So, so here's that slide again. And then this is in the exhibition there. This is De Flauw Animalis, which means to flow away or disappear. And this set of images was taken while I was on the Arctic Circle program, that same program in 2010. And here's Svalbard. You get to see way up there, and then I was on this tiny island right there. It's probably the first north I'll ever get, and we were there with this group, just us and this group of this herd of a walrus, and there's nothing, and there's above the tree line, it's just absolutely nothing, you know, there's rock, etc. But it was just us and these guys. So this incredible experience of like meeting this herd of walrus. And the piece actually has a video component too. There's this corner cave of, you see them in the snowstorm moving, and then humans sort of disappearing into the snow. But you see here, there she shows this really stark landscape that's and these ghosting images of walrus, and their species its survival is highly dependent on the platform of sea ice that's precipitously shrinking. So, and it's very dramatic. It's I could go in depth about what's happening to the walrus. They're all hauling up in weird places because there's no ice. It's terrifying and really heartbreaking. And then here's the human. You just see the humans disappearing as well, kind of ghosting. And these were shot with an analog camera too, so there's a treatment of the image, but there's a straight photograph of just it's a long exposure, so there's a motion of either the animal or people that's causing that ghosting. It's not a digital manipulation. And this is just an installation shot of that work at the Brower Center here in Berkeley a few years ago. And then through Markers of Time and this initial experience with the fox, I started to think about ways to represent change that were already highly visible in the Arctic as well as in the tropics. And I began to seek out biological scientists. So this is Denver Holt, who's an owl expert who I've had the privilege of working and going out in the field with, just outside of Barrow again, where I've spent quite a lot of time, which is way north, just like the north coast of Alaska. And this was in summer of 2012. And he's been working there for 40 years now, monitoring snowy owls and working with the indigenous population there. There's scientific community and indigenous population, Nupiaq, that run that whole the North Slope, and there he's one of a few of the scientists have a really respectful and interesting, very thoughtful relationship with that and the Nupiaq community there. So it was really an honor to work with him, and his tasks are to check the nests like as quickly as possible not to disturb the animals. And so snowy owls are a barometer for the health of the Arctic ecosystem, and as charismatic species with a great deal of symbolism in many cultures, it seemed like a good place to start with this sort of investigation in terms of animals as these kind of stand-ins for us and as a way to talk about climate change. And if the owl pair is healthy, the male will dive bomb you to protect its nest. So we had quite a few of this experience happening, and that owl's wingspan is like mine, like 5 feet. They're massive and incredibly beautiful creatures. And I often talk about this experience in my lectures. It's one of the few in my life where I felt I was brushed up against a deep kind of wildness. And it was one of the great privileges of my life to be this close to such a beautiful creature in the fierce act of living. And as a side, just to mention, we'd always leave as quickly as possible to not disturb them. But there are no trees up there, so all the birds lay their eggs on the tundra, just on the ground. So you have to be really careful where you're walking. And so then this segues into species impact, which you'll see this snowy owl that exact snowy owl is in the exhibition there as part of these daguerreotypes. And species impact is again in response to the current extinction crisis to create an empathic exchange between viewers and our animal kin in order to activate an emotion-based or spirit-driven response to these facts or data. And at the time, this became more about the extinction crisis as a framework of thinking hadn't been completely sort of sorted out as a concept or as clear when I started this. So it was really also just about also registering through more and more relationships with scientists how all of these species are being impacted by climate change directly. I'm seeing it. We're looking at it. It wasn't a theory. It was very clear, in situ. So this work eventually evolved into my photographing these 10 species impacted by climate change. It took about 4 years and became a set of daguerreotypes. And 5 are from these are the 5 from the Arctic, and they're 5 from the tropics. And the daguerreotype is one of the earliest photographic processes. It's made on a mirrored surface. So let's see if I can get this through. The image shifts with light and angle between the ghost negative, the trace positive, so sort of the straight photograph, and the direct reflection of the viewer. So you kind of can't avoid yourself sort of intertwined with the subject you're seeing. And this alternation between the ghost and the positive And the mirror was fitting to the early use of the daguerreotype, as many daguerreotype portraits were made of soldiers heading off to war. It aligned with the Civil War in the United States. And so the portraits quickly became set of post-mortem images, and they were known as memento mori, so sort of memories of, you know, lost, the loss, and that are associated with this particular photographic process. So I found it a really interesting sort of just conversation with history and the medium, and then all of the images, all of the animals were shot in the they're set in the center, looking at towards or posing as if for the camera, and then speaking to the history of portrait photography and painting before that. And they serve as these kind of stand-ins. They're very of this collection of anthropomorphized moments, right? So it's like it's sort of like setting them almost like in this human space, though they're actually these very calm, still moments of very kinetic wild lives, you know, that are existing on a changing planet. And so here, these two are in the show there. And the complexity of what this process and experience means, it is meant to be a kind of metaphor, obviously, for the moment, this ghosting, this sort of liminal threshold space. And so again, here you see that kind of reflectivity in the images. So in 2012, through a grant from the Canary Project, who are collaborators of mine, who are also artists in their own right, I traveled to the Galapagos and photographed the 5 tropical species. This is the marine iguana that's in the show there. And then this is a sea turtle, green sea turtle. And here, I think there's a little, terrible at filming underwater. It's really hard. I learned a lot about how I shouldn't do it, and gained a lot of respect for those who do film underwater. But I got the shot I needed. And then here, let's see, these should play. This is in Greenland. I started working with the Institute of Arctic Studies, where I am now at Dartmouth College, and traveled to Greenland. I've been there now 3 times, but the first time I went, I was there to photograph the muskox on the left, they're very elusive, very shy guys. So I was really lucky. And the caribou, and this is the caribou in the far north in Greenland. They actually travel in pairs or solo, like by themselves. In Alaska and Canada, they herd. So that was interesting too. I'd be sort of way out in the tundra again, way above the tree line, and then just a single, you know, this single animal would come. It was an incredible experience. All of my experiences, honestly, with animals has been just deeply, I feel like deeply privileged to have had them. And here are the two that I ended up getting. And then the next of kin exhibition, the research goal was to create a nuanced experiential space of mourning. So really an emotional space within a science context, which is an analytic space. So so we have an analytic brain and emotional brain, in relationship to the extinction crisis. Now this is really had established as a concept, and using human psychology to draw out the viewer's attention and elicit this kind of more emotional, spirit-driven reaction to the topic, especially within a space of the facts, right, and data. And so in 2016, I was invited by the Harvard Natural History Museum to design an exhibition and make a new body of work in relationship to the topic of the current extinction crisis. And this was in partial collaboration with these same guys at the Canary Project. And while this was a huge project for which I managed about 20 people in a massive production, it took a good year and a half. I'm going to breeze through it really quickly just to kind of get through to the end here. And I was teaching full time that year. I started this, and I would drive down about 2 hours to Cambridge from where I live to work in the collections every Friday, just at the end of my teaching week, and then to just develop the project. And on a visit to Mammalogy, the collection manager mentioned the story of the sable, which is this kind of large antelope-looking mammal, and that one member of the species is extinct and another cousin species is endangered. And then in ornithology, so in the bird collections, there on a visit, that collection manager opened this drawer of tropical birds called honey creepers, these beautiful birds, and explained, pointing to the group of specimen there. These are extinct, and these are endangered and will become extinct in the next 30 years. And this scenario repeatedly came up in my dialogue with both of them, and the idea of next of kin came into being. So the project came to focus on mammals as our natural next of kin, and birds as a kind of representation of freedom of imagination and a global network of animals that infiltrate our daily lives. So just really quick, this was a really quick tour of this very complex show, actually. Had 3 parts, the mirrored next of kin portraits, 2 of which are in the show there. I think you have the jaguar and the sable there. So I think you'll see them in a second. And a set of 9 sculptural installations using mostly extinct specimens. So just their artifacts, you can see them here in these cases, and a couple endangered species too. And then there's audio of extinct bird calls that we used a library from the Cornell ornithology lab. They have this incredible bird collection of bird everything, honestly. We worked with an audio engineer at Matthew Patterson Curry. And then the daguerreotypes I just showed you were also in the show. And I wanted to include all the collection areas, including invertebrates and like underwater friends and insects and stuff, but for a range of reasons, just complexity of actually dealing with those specimen, we settled on mammals and birds. And then over and over, this idea of like next of kin came into being. So here you can see this trunk of a tree here. They have, because 2 extinct species of birds nested in the same trunk in Mexico. And so it's this kind of amazing just object. There's nothing, so we just made like a wood floor for it, and you just have this engagement with the sort of last home of 2 entire species of birds. And then there's a narwhal tusk on the left there, broken to parts that they don't know what happened. Maybe there was an accident, but and it's sort of laid out like a medieval sword with this, there's like a Latin phrase on it. So there's all of these cases have these kind of poetics to them. And then there's also before I get into that, there's also on the didactics or the little panels, there's always a little bit of like you'll have the Latin name of the animal like you would expect in a science museum, but then also some kind of poetic fact or something there. And also W.S. Merwin, who's an incredible poet who's passed away a couple years ago now, but 2 of his poems are on the wall. So then you hear these bird calls of birds that are extinct. One of them, it's so heartbreaking. One of them is of a bird calling, the last bird of its kind, trying to call out to a mate that isn't there anymore. So it was a really moving kind of wild space. And so I was also really starting to think about these design elements to bring it back around to the beginning of my talk here. I started to think about how I can activate deeper response. What are tools? And here's just a really quick list. So mirroring, using the mirrors is really like bringing you into the conversation and creating this indexicality, and also this sort of empathic gaze with the animal, the scaling 1-to-1 or 1 to the whole, the suggestion of a narrative. So there's sort of you as a viewer and the animals as characters in the animal kingdom there. The experiential, so you'd hear sound. There's actually the mirrored light boxes I'll show you in a second, or changing in terms of their brightness. And then there's a language of the traditional portrait, so they're sort of anchoring into something we understand historically. Again, the empathic gaze, and then the charismatic specimen, so these stories, right, of these individuals, really, right, within the cases. And then I'll just to keep going, there's, again, you see these other ideas of enchantment, the stand-in, emotional conduits, etc. And then let's see, sorry, get down to the new work. These next of kin portraits really focused on the empathic gaze as the central concept. And here you see photographs taken of taxidermied specimens, so these taxidermied animals that you find in the other halls, just straight on, these direct photos, so they're looking straight at you. And they're designed so isolated, with a black background behind their face, and there's a 2-way mirror on the front. So when they're designed to start really low, like dim, and then so it's like a hall of mirrors, and then slowly they brighten over a very slow period of time to replace your face and then disappear again. So if you're looking in them, there's this kind of, you're morph into the animal and then they disappear again. And they're shot with a super sharp lens, so they're sort of built out so they feel so very real. Actually, someone asked me if they were real, and I was like, no, I don't think I'd be alive. There's a tiger in there, and there's a couple of species you definitely want to be in the face of. But they really are, again, this sort of ghosting happens again. That sort of, they have a really direct relationship and dialogue with the daguerreotypes. And then here you can also see them in a gallery setting, like what you see there at the art center. They're set with, they're just at a certain brightness, and then the daylight and the shift of light in the space really do inform the experience of them. So In this case, it was in my gallery in San Francisco, and it had a huge window. So over the arc of the day, it would, if it was really bright, you could barely, it just looked like mirrors, and you get up there and you realize there's a little bit of a face of an animal. And then when you left, I mean, if you came in later in the day, you'd actually really, they'd really be starting to come out. So I kind of love that collaboration with the ambient light. And then here's just what they look like. They pulled them out of these cases for us to photograph, my assistant and I to photograph, which was amazing. They're incredible. Like whoever, there are a couple of animals that got edited out because if taxidermy goes awry, it's terrifying. So it's like the absolute opposite, yeah, experience. So really, the ones that made the cut were just like exquisitely created, and such a privilege. Also, you never could be this close to a jaguar, for example, right? And so just to actually spend time, it's wild because it's like crazy to get over how much death you're around really in this museum. But once you get past that, it's this like kind of I have such a deep love for animals and birds, and here on the wall you see on the left there's all this huge wall of hummingbirds, and it's just incredible. It's really, really incredible. So here's just, again, this is the one you guys have there, the sable and the jaguar. So really quickly, I know we're getting, okay, I'm just checking time. Okay, so I have one more project or two more quick projects and then a little outro. So Terra Systema is, this research goal is to conceptually scale the planet to the human body to register our indexical vulnerabilities. So meaning the planet's vulnerability and ours. So to connect the singular system of self or the viewer to the whole of the planet, and using the roles of the Arctic and tropical ecosystems what they play in our imaginings and understandings of the Earth as a whole. And then to use these novel photographic materials and printing techniques to point to the body. So I'll explain that in a second. So this project, Terra Systema, or Earth Systems, transmogrifies the tropical rainforest and the melt of the Panamanian tropical rainforest and the melt of the Greenland ice sheet into respective respiratory and circulatory systems, with the idea of scaling the planetary to the human body. And the work uses the role again of the Arctic and tropical ecosystems as this sort of space of understanding the self, like the whole of the planet, to connect the self to the whole. And so the project began through extended research and work at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Station on the island of Barro, Colorado in the Panama Canal, where I've spent now 3 different sort of sessions there working. And as I was a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow in 2014 with the Canary, 3 of us each got a research fellowship, and we did some work at the Natural History Museum in DC that will come in, I won't tell you about now, but will turn into a project that's coming. And I was able to connect to the station as an artist, which was amazing because it's a science station. And we actually work very similarly. It was fascinating to I've been working with scientists for a while, but it really sort of registered when I got there how it was like the perfect environment for the way that I was working anyway, where there's just very simple setup of food and somewhere to stay that, it's very, very, it's like dorm sort of style and just cafeteria. But just that's all you need. You just need somewhere to stay and food, and I could go work, and I could register my project like it was a science research project, which it really was very similar, just different sort of approach over about 4-year period. And this half of the project is around translating the tropical rainforest as a kinetic, living, breathing system. And so I traveled over 2 years for this project to the station with an assistant, and the field work was eventually consisted of about 8 hours work hiking in this network of overgrown complex trails on the island. And then the shooting process was made up of multiple daily rounds of setting up and taking down that same 4x5 and a DSLR camera in this extreme heat and humidity. And you have to be covered because there are little insects everywhere. So you have to sort of duct tape your boots to your pants and just be, you kind of just go into a real kind of zombie state of just, you have to zen out in that environment and get used to it. But it's a lot of waiting for the light and air to change, which was very meditative. It's really this kind of beautiful way to connect to that place of just sort of being in it and waiting for like the air and understanding like the rhythms of the day and when the light changed and when the sort of wind would shift and that kind of thing. Pretty amazing. And then through these video and long exposures, Respiro, which is the rainforest half, which means breath, situates the viewer within the motion of the breath of the canopy. And so I would take these long exposures and kind of overexpose them to create this sort of almost like photosynthesis, sort of thinking of like how light is this huge force in how we're thinking about the rainforest. And I photographed purposely so you have no footing, and it's really difficult to orient yourself to the environment. So this enhances this space, this sort of feeling of being integrated. And they're designed to kind of compound and confuse photographic time. So I set the viewer within this continuousness of the cycle. So just sort of, there's no edge to this moment, and that's become really important in here. And they're hard to translate on the screen because they're two prints actually. There's a top layer of almost like a skin of a vellum archival print over a opaque normal sort of digital inkjet. And so they have this, they really, as you move past them, they kind of move because there's this dimensionality of the way the two layers, these two prints, these two exposures are interrelating. And then in response to growing concern with the alarming rate of melt off the Greenland ice sheet, I traveled to Kingalusak, Greenland over 2 summers. And I began a series of similar works to play out the kinetic life of the ice sheet melt, concentrating on the accumulation of the movement of water of this mass country of ice. The work called Flumen, which means the flow, follows the path of water, starting as glistening drips of melting ice that cumulatively build into an exponential force, one powerful enough to affect the balance of our entire planet by altering the stability of the circulatory system or our network of ocean currents. So here in Kingalusak, is set on the edge. It's a town that's set on the edge of a huge fjord. It's a Greenlandic town that has developed out of a defunct army base, and it has one of very few airports in the country that's large enough to allow both government and commercial airlines to land. And so there's a science station set up there, and scientists come from all over the world. Then the longest road in Greenland is a 25-mile rough dirt road that runs from the town's edge to the edge of the ice sheet. And here's just our 4x5 truck. We'd take a satellite phone out to, and you have to sign out. Here's the sign out, and if you don't come back by the time they'll wait like an hour, and then they'll emergency come find you because it's pretty dangerous too in a lot of ways. But this is here's the road. It's one of the only places to access the edge of the ice sheet in Greenland by foot. So that's why it's so helpful to scientists to be able to kind of really understand, get onto the ice this way. And at the end of this 25-mile road, you can walk up onto a glacial moraine and out onto the ice. And then the Greenland ice sheet, here you're seeing the edge of it, it makes up 80% of 660,200 square miles. So it's just a massive piece of ice. And then it's unbelievable amount of water coming off. Here it gets loud. This is along this kind of waterway that comes off the ice sheet. I'm at this big waterfall is one point in there. And then, so here's the Institute of Arctic Studies director who I've worked with, these scientists that are researching there. We'd all go out and I'd go do my work and they'd do theirs, especially the first year. And the second year I was with someone, we just could go work. But and for these water pieces, again, I'm using 2 different lengths of exposures combined to pair. And then one's really sharp and one's soft. And so this is kind of bizarre, like conceptual, like it's hard to read time again. And they have this quality that's, again, really hard to translate without seeing them in person. Okay. So the last project I'll talk about is Perdita and Finding, which is the idea is to express the inherent disorientation and tentativeness brought on by exponential change. So I'll just again breeze through this. But this is really in response more recently, it's still like a couple years old, to this moment of dramatic political, cultural, and environmental flux that we're inside of. And it really is about facing into the tentativeness of this exponential change. And I'm using the word perdita, Latin for lost, and then drawing on a content of materials over about 10 years of all these trips, these findings that are accumulated over the last 10 years. And so exponential ice, this piece here, is in the show too, and it's which I'll tell you about in a second. So I'm looking through like aesthetic and photographic familiarity come in. I'm really deconstructing the medium a lot in this project. I'm really trying to get you to think about sort of how we view the landscape and where history of photography is coming into play. So the central piece from the project is Quantari Glacius, which means exponential ice. was photographed up in Svalbard on that trip. It's the and it's made up of 11 prints of this of a photograph, a 4x5 photograph of this glacier, Gully Breen, and each are mounted on a thin layer of board, then mounted together, so they form this kind of pyramid. So it's actually coming out in space, but actually when you're looking in, you're getting sucked in. So there's this real kind of hypnotic convergence happening. And this imagery is deceptively fixed and unsteadying at the same time, and reinforcing the limitations of capturing and comprehending through photographic media. And then I'm gonna just I'll show you one other piece from this, but just for the sake of time, because I see we're kind of hitting time. And so this is another piece that's a faint stitched together landscape printed on warm toned delicate newsprint that depicts a place called Abandon, a physical place in Svalbard up there, and you can actually find it on the map. It's just called, it's like a little pinpoint called Abandon. And the overt stitched aesthetic that I've created here is meant to kind of point to the fragmentation of place, or this sort of inability to really understand place. And there's this sort of question of whether this is fictitious or real, or is it being dismantled or put together. And it's this, it almost looks like a drawing as a print. It's very subtle. And in line with this piece, you see this kind of compass made of my thumbs. And I was just actually helping. I was documenting this for a friend who was creating this like virtual reality world out of Abandon, just to help him know which direction we were looking. And in the end, it became this really interesting kind of compass of like the body being in there, and this sort of understanding of place that feels almost ridiculous or impossible to understand. And here, there's also this interesting language of sort of Arctic exploration, where you see I happen to catch the structure in the background, my tripod, and then the ship we were on. This really, it was a 100-year-old schooner, looks so, from another time. And so there's this sort of language of Arctic exploration that's in there too, and it's on paper like all of these newsletters they would send home. So the first reports from the Arctic came back on this kind of paper. And it's worth noting, no Western woman would have been up there at the time, let alone wielding a camera. But the piece again was like really trying to think about how that place is disappearing, and impact and history, etc. So so just lastly, my current research is really thinking about has been reinforced by the stillness I've had to hold still. I haven't been able to travel, of course, and this amplified this kind of unprecedented time we're in. And I'm also one of very few souls who've witnessed the evolving impacts of climate change firsthand over a very dramatic decade. And so and do this, I'm interested in the possibilities of what my rare experience can offer the climate communication conversation. And I began related research in 2020 in Edinburgh as an environmental humanities fellow, which was interesting because I was part of the humanities as an artist, which was a great experience at the University of Edinburgh. And I centered again on researching artistic techniques to activate tenderness and empathy and human vulnerability in the public. And I'll be actually starting a self-designed master's program in line with this same research at the Harvard Divinity School in the fall. And I'm looking at contemporary art as a space of spiritual holding in conversation with science as a way to develop more effective climate crisis communication. So I'm just going to jump to Dissonance, this piece, and then do an outro, because I know we're sort of getting to the last few minutes and I don't want to go too long. But Dissonance is also in this exhibition, and this is my most recent piece. It's the most personal piece in a way. I'm not in my work in any other, maybe my hand's in there a little bit, but this is a really different kind of piece for me. And its goal is to create a parallel consideration of our vulnerability and our power to impact. And the strategy is to activate the viewer as through the sensory dissonance of bodily experience of the harsh and rapidly changing Arctic environment, and pointing to the role of mediating technologies and the role they have on our misunderstanding of the environment. So there's purposeful glitching that you'll see in that film, and you'll see, I'm going to play a little bit of it in a second. So this is just stills from it, and here I'll just scroll through a few of the shots of that, and then there's quite a lot that happens in it where that you won't see today, but if you have the chance in the space to see it, I breathe on the lens. There's this kind of sense of the body in there. You can hear my breath. There's kind of the beat of, and my footsteps are in there and things like that. And there's this glitching and this, that you see my hand, and you sort of sense the cold, and you'll get that in a second. So I'm just gonna, I'm gonna turn off my video because this is a transition into this kind of performative piece as an outro. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, give me one, let me fix this. I am dissonance. What does it mean to be human in this? What does it mean to be singular, vulnerable, and tender inside the enormity of this moment? Planetary flux. For the third time, I've climbed out onto the edge of this country of ice, Greenland. This time, something deep has shifted in me. So much more has changed over such a short time since I was last here. Too much. My psyche is overwhelmed, my soul self silent, trying to feel it out. I focus inward. This time I find my own edges, my own pulse, my breath and beat, my own temperatures. I feel my feet on this ground of ice and dust. I smell the crispness of the air here. I feel it actively where my skin is bare, and I listen. I listen from the core of me. I listen like I always do first, from that core soul space in me, that guide. But this time I shift deeper. I use the whole of my body. I consider it itself as the conduit for some other way to explain this all to you. I am breakable. We are. I am small in the world. We are. I am animal. I am breathing. I am beating. We are. I'm supposed to report back, to tell you it all in a particular way you can categorize. Some familiar trope of story. Yes, I have been there. I have borne witness over the arc of dramatic change. 10 years. And I saw this, and you expect a tidy story, one that we can fit inside of, one we can react to in the usual ways. But this, it is wild and far wider than we can easily comprehend. It is about a deep, entangled dissonance. The only way to translate it authentically is to use my body as a conduit, to position yours here with mine, to feel your way into it. We must feel our way into it together. This means use our entire bodies, all of our senses, our intuition, our guts, feelings, our needs, our humility, our animalness. I am a body of simultaneous privilege and wild vulnerability. I'm set wide open on this otherworldly stage, listening with all of me, listening so hard I am regularly brought to tears. Years of facing into it, of witness and realizations, ghosts that haunt and facts that I house about all the life impacting change. And this love affair with the edge of things, it has been the most important thread in my life. It is also so devastatingly beautiful. The way the sunlight amplifies the energies of water and ice moving around me, set here among a million diamonds in a system of such visual complexity I don't know where to look. I pick up one small frozen piece from the edge of a flowing Mulan. Its formation designed by the motion of water, and I hold it up to the Arctic sunlight. My fingers freeze in the air and against its tiny glassy surface. The sublimity felt from this examination is infinitely worth the correlated bodily breakdown. I hold it and turn it and feel it in my fingers until they are numb. Then, without touch as guide, I grip a bit harder and just enough to keep this gem from slipping. I consider it slowly in the brightness until the heat of my body thins its edge beyond a delicacy I can grasp, and it slips back into the twinkling flow of it all at my feet. I'm learning about my body, love, and impact. the power of my a system of flow winds its way to the fjord and eventually out to sea. This network of melt from the ice sheet to ocean is visibly comprehensible. My first night in the brightness of the Arctic summer, I climbed the nearby outcropping that looks out over the town of Kangerlussuaq where we stay. It's a breathtaking 360-degree view, and all I could focus on was the sound of the water in the river way below, like white noise turned up too loud, so much water echoing its motion throughout this wide space. All I could do was feel what this meant, with my body, with my full set of senses, to register it as a knowing, the most important kind. We are at an unprecedented moment. I cannot say this loud enough. I come from the front lines. Believe me. I will say it again. We are at an unprecedented moment. All I can say from all that I house is what we need to start to collectively think in new and generous ways. Not built out of fear, but built out of inclusivity and possibility. We need to be in and of the world, to feel it more and notice how we are not separate. And so I offer you these portals, gentle portals that suggest new ways of sensing yourself inside this cultural shift, incremental but tangible ways to accept the fact of the climate crisis and what it implies, essentially to aid in the comprehension of what the Anthropocene means about us and our home planet. I invite through the work for you to feel your way in, to slow and quiet and register yourself to a larger world. We must face into this new reality. We must, as the theorist Donna Haraway says, stay with the trouble in order to find our way out and find ourselves fully human as emotional and intellectual animals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful way to end your talk. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions on Facebook Live? So while living with this work here at the Art Center, I love the fact that your Next of Kin series both implicates the viewer and also invites the viewer at the same time to have this dialogue with thinking about endangered species, and thinking about the portrait of an animal is also having a dialogue with the way we consider portraiture also. I'm curious with Lux. I'm curious what discoveries, because you talked about the fact that the researchers at Harvard, that when they were showing you, this was at Harvard, right?
Yeah, you know,
They were showing the ornithologists or what have you was saying like, this is the bird that's extinct. Well, going back to Lux first, I guess, because you talked about in Boston that the tides changing, there's a luminescence that affected, when you have a reflecting light. I'm curious as to what discoveries, like, because you did this over a period of 5 years, right?
That's right. Yeah. 5 years.
5 years. So what kind of discoveries were those coming out of after you were processing the photographs?
Yeah, some of it I really I didn't know, I couldn't have imagined the way the information would kind of register on the negative. So yeah, there are a lot of discoveries. That was a really interesting kind of relationship. Maybe why it was so slow, and there's all these, what's the right word? Just all these kind of moments of like, oh, that's what the medium does when, you're like a long period of time happens, or this sort of new comprehension of the moment. Like I was in this 1 hour period having one experience, and then what happens, in the image, and all these sort of multiple little moments of time that then register as one thing, as one sort of full moment, was fascinating too, right? And to deal with that over 5 years too, where in different cultures and places too, and even the language of light is different in different regions. So and activity is different, and our relationship to nighttime was really different in those 3 places. So the US, we're really afraid of nighttime. It's like a lot really fear-based like dialogue basically with darkness. And Europe is really different. I think there's in the summer especially, there's a lot of, you know, outdoor activities in the evening, and that's really different. It's just part of culture, and people stay up later, and it's just different. And then in Japan also, there are all these, it was amazing, there are all these places. One of the really coolest places I went was in Sapporo. There was in northern Japan, there's this trail up to a lookout where I photographed, and they had like speakers playing Japanese pop music in the forest. It was dark, but in at night, you know. And so it was like, and it was very safe, and you know, it's just kind of amazing. Just
Oh,
really
wow.
different way of sort of understanding nighttime too. So that would even there's subtle things like that had me thinking and got me really um yeah, just fascinated, to be honest. And then what would happen in the photographs, right? So I think that project had a really big effect on what, you know, I haven't reflected on it as fully as I could, to be honest, but how it changed the way I started thinking about making. And I don't, in terms of segueing it into maybe this, it's portraits of cities to portraits of an animal or something. There's sort of there is this relationship, right? There's sort of like this idea of place and almost the language of portraiture and lux, but in a really different way. And then with the, I think next again, I think you were pointing at the mirrored surface part of it. Yeah, so
Right.
that I'd had that idea for a long time to use the two-way mirror. And it just I just things sort of clicked into place. And the daguerreotypes I was already working on, so I'd started that play out with those, and that took a while just because I had to, those were all in real, like in the wild. So we had to get to the animals. But I think there's something that I just it one of the biggest challenges I think for contemporary artists that use and work with photography is getting people to stay longer, right? Because we're so used to, everyone's a photographer, we're so used to looking at images, that we also need this sort of other way to get you to stay. And so that was part of the mirror, is like we also have this we're very self-reflective right now else as a culture. And so the mirror has become this really interesting space of conversation, but also gets you like really, you're in there, you can't separate yourself from the whole. We are mammals, we are part of the system, we are part of the animal kingdom. And I think it was really effective. They were hung in a corner in that show, and so they'd bounce off each other too, which was really cool and interesting. And how they'd allowed these other dialogues to happen in the space, and just there's way more I could do. I'm looking forward to even future shows where I can play more with that, and like what the mirrored surface can do to kind of help activate the idea of like even us as characters in this sort of narrative or the story too.
Yeah,
Hope
Karen
that
has a
answered.
comment.
Yeah. Oh
We
yeah.
got a comment from Karen Robin, but before I get to hers, I want to also say if one of your photographs is, if anybody wants to look on the website, I'll put it up.
Yeah.
Actually, let me put it up here. I actually went to my birth city of Miami, and
Yeah.
because I
Oh,
was
cool.
curious,
Yeah.
I hadn't read that you said that you did that intentionally, that you
Oh,
obfuscated the
yes.
locating
Yeah.
ability to that. And of course, I went to look at it. Let me see where it is. I'll put the link up.
Yeah. Thanks.
And I have to say, true to what you said, I immediately thought, oh, that's from the Julia Tuttle Causeway.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it
Yeah. Especially
was?
Miami. There's only one place to go. It was a hard one. Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so
Yeah, but
Christina,
I like hearing that too, because I think with if you've had a deep relationship to play one of those places, right? You can usually sort of suss it out. Even San Francisco, I grew up in looking across the bay to San Francisco, and I took it from a place that's a little less usual to see it. And again, you have to like, oh, you know, you sort of do that strategizing, and it's nice.
right.
Yeah.
So Karen said a great
Oh
deal to
yeah.
think about. Oh, you can see it too, I guess. You have the chat
Yeah,
window.
sure. But go ahead. Yeah, we can read.
I'll just read it
So
out for everybody that
yeah,
doesn't see
please.
the
Yeah,
chat window.
it's helpful.
A great deal to think about in all of us dealing with climate change in the future. Your photography has shown changes occurring in our environment to alert us to climate change. Your manipulation of methods of photography are very interesting. I agree.
Oh,
And I
thank
love
you.
how you
Thank you,
also,
Karen.
hearkening Karen's comment, how the daguerreotype, which thank you for that little, for everybody that's not familiar with it, it was great that you
Sure.
brought
Yeah.
the question, but it has
Little
this real
obscure.
personal tangible connection as well.
Yeah, that's right. And you also, the daguerreotype, there are two versions. The one that hangs in the show is framed, but that series has a small, like, handheld version too, which is also, you would get this picture of your loved one made and have it carry it with you, right? And so there's a little version too of the species impacts series where that comes in a little case, and it's with that same idea that you can kind of carry it with you. Yeah.
Does Terry have a question? It looks like
Oh, yeah.
Terry wants to say something.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I don't seem to have access to the chat box. I'm on my phone and we are driving towards Salina from Chicago.
Oh, good.
We're driving across Missouri now, and I'm thinking about the many layers of landscape and history and native peoples who have lived here and used this land and the deep geology. And then it seems like sort of the perfect context for listening to Christina's talk.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of questions, but I thank you so much. It was just a beautiful, beautiful
Thank you.
talk. And I admire the way you integrate your very personal, deeply felt experience with serious academic research. And so my question is kind of about that. I was wondering, when you start a project, do you start with a question you have about the subject and then do some research and then begin to have an idea about what that might look like visually, or how, can you say a little something about how that initial process starts to unfold?
Yeah, sure. I think it's been different with different projects, to be honest. Lux was more like I had this framework of what the project would be, and then I had to execute it over this long period of time just because it took so long. So that was a little more tidy and really understanding what it was going to be from the ish from the beginning. Took a little bit, but to really get that figured out. But Markers of Time is an interesting one because that was a really important moment for me, that work up, like moving up to Alaska and then really experimenting. I didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. I just tried a lot of stuff, and I'm still processing those materials as they're coming into that Perdita and finding work, but also just like really I'm still realizing I was just there's some deep experimenting there that stayed with me. And I think it opened up a realm of trying something and then researching. It would give me an idea, almost like doing something would give me an idea, and then that would lead me in that project. And then I sort of built edges to what a way to enter into fairly abstract kind of territory with thinking about our relationship to time. Time is so hard to grapple with, right? It's such a complex animal. And so yeah, I think that project was a space of kind of like making something intuitively and then putting edges to it and researching, and then making something from that research, and then again making something intuitively, and then things starting to like work themselves out, and I realized what I was doing. That sounds weird, but it was that intuitive at the beginning with that word. And then later, so Terra Sistema, I had a very clear idea for Panama, for the rainforest. But at first that project was going to be the canal, so cargo ships, and like man-made and economic system with the rainforest, natural system. And I couldn't work out the cargo, and I actually am in the middle of this sound piece, so now the cargo is becoming this other thing. But in this case, that was really interesting. One half of it was just I know exactly how to make the work through previous, experiments and projects and other stuff. And then Greenland side of it made more sense, but that problem solving was really hard because scaling water is so different than scaling trees. Like a tree's like a body, we really understand the forest in relationship to us, but water is really hard to photograph. So it took me 2 years, two trips there to really, and I it's not easy to get to Greenland, and I'm on these, it's very limited time, and there's a budget, and in between those 2 years, I failed completely the first year. And then in between, I just did all of these tests. There's a river near where I live, and just with the water I had available, and figured it out, and rented a camera, and we had a shot list, and it was just totally different experience of like getting exactly what I needed. And I had a show that was coming up, so I had to get it done. So yeah, it's sort of this balance back and forth. And I think now it's like deeper into my practice or career or life as an artist. I tend to get the ideas, and then I'll play and find the media. And usually it's like, oh, I want to try this visual, and sometimes it fails. Like we all need to fail a lot to make good work, as I tell my students. But lots of the failures become other work later, which is also worth mentioning all the time. It's like, that's Lux. Failure in Luxes became those long exposures to the sun. Like I loaded the film backwards and found out that it did this weird aesthetic thing, and I used that purposely later, So hopefully that answers it. So I don't have a very like tidy answer to that, because my practice is like always changing, and I like that it does, though. I think I love being a beginner, and so that's part of it. Once I get really good at something, I don't want to do anymore. Like I'm sort of like,
Yeah.
it's not fun anymore. It gets stressful. So that's part of it too. Probably the play is important and keeps me in it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
And then does anybody else have another question? Anybody Facebook Live? Let us know. And then while we're waiting on any final thoughts or questions,
Yeah.
I'm curious as to, obviously you've given us a snapshot into your brain as to how you choose the medium, what kind of process, both from a formal aspect and both also from a process based, right? And then the design aspect that you shared with us, which was really wonderful. I'm curious, you just mentioned about water. So I was going to ask you how you're going to attack this, or how you're going to, when you're collecting this information, and does that ever change?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember what we did. Well, one thing that came up, so yeah, it changes in response to what I try, I guess, is a way to think about it. So I'll have an idea how to visually problem solve something, and I'll try it. So with the water, I'm trying to think through the whole process with the water. I initially photographed it more like a landscape, and then they just looked so generically like the land, like you've seen. And it wasn't that in some of those images are so beautiful that other people take, but it wasn't what I wanted to be talking about through the medium. So that was a challenge. And then I realized I could not, in the way water behaves and moves so quickly, I could not do what I needed to do with an analog camera either, which I did in the rainforest was all analog. And so I had to work with a good camera. So that was another thing. So I could play with the camera I had there, but I just couldn't get it down. And I couldn't test in Greenland, for example. The first time I couldn't test what the prints would do, right? So I could take the shots, but it was hard to do, because even opacity in Photoshop's not the same way that vellum behaves exactly. So I couldn't tell how to treat them. And so I had to go do all these tests. We did tons of tests, printing tests that year, to get, and it's the underlying image with the Greenland work is really funny. If you take off the vellum, it's all crazily over sharpened. And anyone who's a fine printer in photography, it's like sacrilegious to do this to a print. Like it looks insane, but it makes it so sharp that it will come through in this really, because it's softened by that vellum, right? So stuff like that, which is really, that being back in the studio with that work was really fun. It wasn't so like anal, like Lux, you had to spot every tiny thing. It's like just a really different kind of crazy making, printing process. And this was like, oh, okay, we're gonna over sharpen and see if that, I love that. I think I'm sort of like an engineer or something in their mind, where I want to see how things work together. So that was a lot of like back and forth of what you're talking about. So I had an idea, I'd get the thing, try it, and then I just had to know what I was doing by the end. So we'd just pretend and photograph the river or whatever. Until I could get to the ice sheet. So it's a lot of intuition, to be honest. It's like learning how to really trust the gut stuff. And it's taken years to honor that and make space for it, you know. We don't talk about it a lot in our culture, you know, just um that means really, right? And as an artist, it's vital. It's like it is really, I would argue, probably all of us who have a life, a creative life, that's the most important thing to protect, right? It's like this, whatever sort of telling you to do something, you really listen to that and honor it and follow it, and it leads you in some crazy places too. And sometimes you fail. And again, I think I have this really very gentle relationship to failure. It's not a problem to fail for me. And maybe that's helpful, but I don't work so traditionally, right? It's like,
Mhm.
it's not a big deal anymore at all to just like, oh, it
Yeah,
didn't work.
failure, that's such an interesting discussion. I remember Paul Pfeiffer, the artist Paul Pfeiffer's,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
a lot of his most important works early on were due to failure. He
Yeah.
was unable
I
to
could
remove
see
one
that.
of a figure from one of his videos, and
Yeah.
that became the impetus for
Yeah.
this whole body of work about erasure and
Yeah.
thinking about erasure in images and ghosting and
Yeah.
all kinds of things that he employed. Do your students, by the way,
Yeah.
listen to you? I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah, and
When you try
actually,
to
I
get them.
increasingly have them watch me like recorded, you know, one of these. I'll just say, okay, I just want you to know where I'm coming from teaching you before we start. I used to never do that actually at all, and now it's become important because it's like I also teach where it's really about that we immediately talk about failure, especially at Dartmouth. It's just, I mean, in an institution like that, they're so hard on themselves. It's wild, incredibly, really, really hard on themselves. And so to just get that space opened up for play and experimentation and then yeah, and so I also want them to understand the depth of my committed practice to the world. Like I have, you know, what it means, where I'm talking to them from. Um, so yeah, I do, and I'm in it with them. I don't always share exactly where I am working. I'm very private about what I'm doing right now with anybody, you know, just to protect it myself. But I kind of teach them to do that too if they can, you know, my seniors anyway.
But that's good because it seems that experimentation is and play,
Yeah,
or I mean, well thought out and well metered, right, is part
yeah,
of your practice. And I
yeah,
wonder, because a lot of times students have a very formal way of approaching projects, and they see things a lot of times as as the
yeah. That's
process is
right.
dictated by the medium,
Yeah,
rather than thinking of how the medium might come
yeah,
out of
yeah,
exploring this. And that's
yeah.
something,
That's right. That's a good way to put it.
because that your work really, because there are moments in which you bring in, like I think of Robert, like the Next of Kin series.
Yeah,
I immediately thought of Robert Smithson's mirroring the landscapes and all these
yeah,
things,
sure. Yeah,
which have problems on their own, don't get me wrong,
sure.
but from a formal aspect, it's a really great way to then, and I didn't realize you had shown them
Yeah,
mirrored against each other.
yeah. Right.
That's
Like that bounce. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. Yeah. Uh, well, thank you so much. This is
yeah.
such a
Thank you.
generous, you were so generous with really giving us a glimpse into your brain, into your practice, and very tangible moments in which we could really understand. So thank you so much. And your
Yeah,
students are very
sure. Thank
fortunate,
you.
by the way,
Thank you.
because definitely would have loved to be in your class. But any other final comments before we bid you a good day? And thanks for joining us, Terry, by
Yeah,
the way.
thanks, Terry. It's so good to have you here. I
Drive
love that you're
safe.
moving through. I know, moving through there. Yeah, safe travels. Thank you, everybody, too, for being here. And yeah,
Thank you all for
yeah, it's
joining us.
nice to connect.
And we'll see you. So Terry Evans will do a closing remarks. That's why she's on the way here. On
Hmm.
Friday evening between 5 and 7, we'll have a closing reception. And again, thank you so much, Christina.
Yeah, thank
Everybody
you.
have a wonderful day. Thank you.